Hello. This is a introduction to what I hope is a series of videos and conversations around the topic that I'm calling deliberately developmental psychotherapy. This is directed towards people um, who are interested in kind of the further reaches of uh, both transpersonal psychology and contemplative psychology, and the promised stages of development that uh, are possible for any human being. And it's my observation that the fields of transpersonal and or contemplative psychotherapy have done a great job in outlining the stages of human development beyond the pre and post conventional stages of what we would call normal human life. But there's been very little, actually, so far in the field of psychotherapy to actually practice in a deliberately developmental way. The practices seem to have been left to uh, the um, the contemplative traditions themselves or the meditative traditions themselves. And psychotherapy seems to have sort of been banished to the basically cleaning up and healing of the lower stages of development, which is very important work. Um, but I'm very interested. It's been actually bothering me over the past couple of years. It's a question that's helped me develop. It's been bothering me. How can we make psychotherapy uh, better earlier on? In other words, can we give people sort of principles and practices even in the earlier phases of psychotherapy that allow people to have much more agency over their own development? So let me begin by just offering a couple of statistics that really fueled my inquiry for any sort of basis in formulating deliberately developmental psychology. The first one is that if you look at all the meta studies of all the factors that make a successful therapeutic outcome, it looks like a bare minimum of 50% to a maximum, say, of 70% of those factors are due to what the client brings in. They're called client factors. And only about 30% of the outcome of a successful psychotherapeutic endeavor is what the therapist brings. And so that means that the outcomes of psychotherapy are twice as likely to be successful based on what the client brings rather than the therapist. So here's another interesting one. In 40 years of outcomes research in psychotherapy, what we're finding is that the outcomes of success have not changed much, if at all. And this is not to say that psychotherapy isn't effective. It's actually very effective. We know that the more therapy you do, the better the outcome. And we know that about 80% of people in the at least in the clinical population that take up psychotherapy do get some benefit. But the fact that we can look back and say that in 40 years, with an explosion of new modalities, much more rigorous standards for education for therapists, much more rigorous standards for supervision of therapists and their continuing education, that nothing much has changed in terms of making psychotherapy better, it really led me to believe that if we want to make psychotherapy better, we could actually be helping clients to be better clients. Now, just a parenthetical note on that last statement about making clients better. In some circles, that could be quite offensive to um, the original tenets of psychotherapy as a whole. Um, so I just want to say there's a therapist named Brad Blanton who wrote what I consider to be an excellent book called Radical Honesty, which actually outlines the first principle I'll talk about in the deliberately developmental psychology um, hypothesis at this point. But it's the principle of engagement. It's the principle of actually really taking a stance of wanting to know what's true as a massive developmental move. Brad Blanton pointed out in his book that in his observation, a third of clients make a lot of progress in therapy, a third make some progress, and that a third don't make much progress at all. In my estimation, that's a little ungenerous, especially with the bottom third. At least statistically, maybe 20% don't make much progress at all. But in what I'm trying to say is, I've thought about these principles long and hard, and what I'm really attempting to do is offer them as a way of thinking about therapy or structuring therapy, both for therapists and people undergoing the process, in a way that maximizes results by giving the most agency as possible. I do understand that the principles themselves are quite challenging and confronting, and that many people who are struggling in some of the lower reaches of development will have a hard time grokking them. The point is that I believe that if you can take the principle itself and say appropriately develop practices or actions in the therapy and outside the therapy. Appropriate meaning they meet the level of development of where the person is. The principles will hold up. But I do want to acknowledge that this is some challenging level of thinking. And so the people who will benefit most from what I'm going to talk about are actually the people who actively want to develop themselves. And I mean that is a little different from simply wanting to feel better and clean up the pain. That is one level of developing. But I think there's a growing number of people who actually want to develop for development's sake in a strange way. And so I think these principles would be a way of looking at how you're engaging in psychotherapy or any of the other practices you're doing that form a kind of way of looking at practice itself. So that's the target audience for the videos. Although I do sincerely believe that these can be distilled to reach people where they're at. So, and then finally, I also believe that actually tussling with the principles, actually furthering the level of understanding you have of them, is in itself developmental. So the actual you know joyous struggle of onboarding these principles in itself will fuel the engines of development as well. So I hope you enjoy.